Okay, today my guest is Professor Günter Stahl. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Günter as a person. Professor Stahl is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Stahl is an academic fellow of the Center for International HRM at University of Cambridge, a fellow of Center for Global Workforce Strategy at Simon Fraser. He serves on the advisory boards of several non-for-profit and for-profit organizations. Also is involved in consulting a variety of industrial and professional services across the globe. His research has been published in leading academic journals and profiled in Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. He has received various prestigious awards, including the AOM Carolyn Dexter Award, the JIBS 2020 Decade Award, Sage Journal of Leadership Awards, AOM Best Paper in International Ethics, Social Responsibility and Sustainability Award. He's currently the editor-in-chief of International Management of Organizations and People, as well as senior editor of Journal of World Business. Thank you, Günter, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Gats. I'm delighted to be part of this series.
Thank you. So, first question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Oh, when I was very little, a preschool child, I guess it changed by the day. One day I wanted to be a firefighter, the next day a detective. And I recall, there was even a time when I wanted to rob a bank. I thought that was the coolest job. So I was at a low level of cognitive moral development. I think I was 4 or 5. But when I was a bit older, an elementary school kid, I wanted to become an archaeologist. So I was fascinated by the stories of Heinrich Schliemann, the famous German archaeologist, discovery of Troy, also the discovery of Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of Kings in Egypt. And, I pressured my parents into going there and visiting, these sites with me. And I was also very interested in fossils, searching for fossils. So I spent many afternoons with my friends digging for fossils in the hope to find a dinosaur egg. Of course, we never found one. We found lots of other interesting stuff like a switchblade knife, even ammunition from World War II. And I remember this very clearly because the mom of one of my friends called the police because she was afraid it would go off.
Wow. So, fascinating. Can you remember your first international trip?
Well, it depends on how you define international. I grew up in a tiny village in the Bavarian Alps, so not far from Austria, and also Switzerland was not far. So my first international or cross-border trip was when my parents took my brother and me to Austria for mountain hiking or shopping, but there was nothing international or foreign about it. It's the people looked like you're at home, and they even spoke the same dialect. Really, the only thing that struck me at the time was that in those days, Germany and Austria had different currencies. So that was long before the European Monetary Union existed. And so one thing that really puzzled me as a kid was that, why a chocolate bar that would cost 1 Deutsche Mark at home all of a sudden cost 7 Austrian shilling. I thought that's outrageous, right? But that was the only thing that was really unusual. But my first truly, I would say, international or foreign experience was actually right around the corner. A 10 minutes drive from my home country when my parents took us to the neighboring town where the American Special Forces were stationed, right? And once a year they opened the doors to the public, and there were all kinds of celebrations, parachute jumping contest. And I remember this was really the first time as a little kid when I saw people of different color, speaking a different language, eating strange food. This is where I had my first root beer float. And it really made a lasting impression on me, I have to say. And it also taught me an important lesson, although I didn't know it at the time, but a point that Rosalie Tang, you know, my co-author on 3 papers, always makes in her papers, is that intranational diversity can be as significant as international diversity, right? So across the border in Austria, everything looked the same, and just a 10 minutes drive from my hometown, you know, there was this exotic place with interesting people who spoke a different language, new food. So that was a lesson learned early in my childhood.
True. About how you got into academia and how you chose IB as a specific area.
Why I chose IB, and especially an interesting question when I chose IB, I think it happened quite early in life. I was actually, this was a question that I was pondering some time ago when Mark Mendenhall and I and 2 colleagues, Mildred Zillin-Skate and Rachel Clapp-Smith, embarked on a book project, and we decided that instead of, you know, writing one of those traditional introductory chapters that nobody wants to read, we do something different. We share with our readers how our personal life experiences shaped us as scholars, right? So the career that we have chosen, the topics we address in our research. And for my 3 co-authors, it was early international exposure, right, that really had an impact. Like Mark Mendenhall, for instance, he grew up in New Zealand and lived in a multicultural community, and then later his parents repatriated to the United States. So he describes himself as a third culture kid here. And then later he went on a 2-year mission to Japan for his church. So lots of intercultural experiences, international experiences. Now, in my case, you know, I was neither a third culture kid, nor did I grow up in a particularly diverse environment. Quite the opposite. You know, I grew up in the probably least diverse environment you can imagine, this tiny village in Upper Bavaria. But I think something that really had an impact on me was that when I was a kid, I was diagnosed what is now known as attention deficit disorder. And in those days, there were not many treatment options, or the existing options were quite primitive. So basically, the treatment that was prescribed, I had to take 2 pills, you know, every day to sedate me. And the doctor told my parents that they should keep everything that could excite me away from me, like watching TV, hanging out with friends. So after school, I had to stay at home. I was not permitted to leave the house for a very long half-year at the time. And, you know, this is when I became an avid reader. So since I couldn't go out, except for very special occasions, I really devoured books. So I remember one of my favorite books was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. So I started daydreaming about, you know, sailing along the Mississippi River, and read lots of books about explorers, like into Africa or to Hayada's Kon-Tiki, dreaming about other cultures. I think this is actually how it all started, how I became fascinated, you know, about other cultures. And then, if you allow me to tell the story to an end. So after about half a year, my parents, you know, basically started questioning, you know, this treatment, and contacted another child psychologist or psychiatrist, and he prescribed something entirely different, took me off the pills, and recommended that I engage in outdoor sports. So I took tennis lessons and quickly started to compete in competitive sports, tennis. And, you know, for much of my teenage years, I was traveling, you know, playing tournaments all over Europe. Now, 2 knee injuries put an end to my tennis career, but this was really, for me, sports became a way to escape, from the narrowness of this environment in which I grew up. And then, after graduating from school, I went on to study in Japan and other countries and spend most of my career outside my native country.
Interesting. If you can do it all over again, what's the second best career path for you?
The second best, well, actually, I mean, that sounds a bit like I'm right in the midst of my midlife crisis, my second or third one, but I would like to live on, a vineyard farm and produce my own wine. I'm a wine lover and have been for many, many years. I spend many of my holidays, in the wine regions of the world, often organize wine tastings or participate in wine tastings. And I also, love the outdoors and enjoy manual work. So that's a distinct career possibility. It still is, actually. So I signed up for a CEMS course later in the year that is part of an international certification program for sommeliers. So if everything goes according to plan, I will be a sommelier, certified sommelier in 2 years, and then I take it from there. So for me, really, the idea of a late career would be to split my time between academia, my current career, which I love, and producing wine. So let's see what happens.
Perfect. Regrets. Have you got any regrets?
Is it possible not to have any regrets in life? Well, maybe it is. The famous American philosopher, Brad Pitt, I think is his name, or maybe it was his spouse, Angela Jolie, said in one of the movies, there are no regrets, just lessons learned, right? I do have regrets, of course, probably less in, the professional domain career. I'm quite happy with what I have achieved. I come from a relatively humble background and, basically have achieved more than I had imagined. But certainly in my personal life, I do have regrets. I mean, probably the most significant is that for many years I didn't spend as much time, for my family, with my family, especially, when my daughter was still little. We adopted our daughter when she was 4 from Cambodia, and this was a time when I was traveling constantly after I got my promotion at INSEAD. I remember my last 3 years at INSEAD, I was actually traveling more than 220 days per year, doing lots of executive education. And I was based in Singapore, but also teaching in Fontainebleau. And so basically my wife Dorrit had to raise Hannah by herself. And, thinking back, this is something that I deeply regret and would do differently if given the chance. And maybe this is also, if you allow me to say that, a piece of advice to maybe younger scholars who are watching the video, that, no career success, no publication in a top-tier journal can compensate for lost time with the people you love. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Of course, pursuing an academic career requires commitment and focus and everything, but it's also important to achieve a certain balance in life, because an academic career, as you know, is not a 100-meter sprint, right? It's more like a marathon, and that's important.
I mean, you touched on a very important topic, and one of the guests in the past, she said, there's no such thing as work-life balance in academia, because the first 6-7 years before the tenure is a treadmill. You are running towards the end of the clock, and then you have to reinvent yourself, and then you have to prove yourself that you're still capable of doing certain things. So she was quite a strong a proponent of that. lack of work-life balance. And, you know, I talk to many people in these interviews, and some of them are very comfortable with a very relaxed and very successful. And some people are on the opposite side of that spectrum. Basically, they are saying, oh, you know, you have to give your 100% all the time. I mean, is it possible really to have this balance, work-life balance? Is it possible in the profession to have a great personal life, social life, family life, and also academic life? Is it possible?
Well, I truly believe it is possible, but it's particularly difficult for academics because also, you know, for the many reasons that you mentioned, but also because we are so passionate about what we are doing, right? And I think that's another factor that, you know, for instance, I come in on weekends to get my research done, right? But it's not about getting tenure, you know, I haven't tenure for a long time. It's because this is something I'm passionate about. You know, it's later in my career, I discovered how important it is to have a balanced life. And I think it's possible. Maybe we should, you know, also give more attention to this topic in educating junior faculty. Maybe a good topic for the next AOM meeting or AIB conference.
Sure. Sure. About research, say you're stranded in a small village. There are people who don't read AMJ, AMR, JIBS. How do you explain your research and why your research is important? What your contributions are? How do you explain your research to people on the street?
Well, if someone asked me this question, I would probably say that, you know, what I hope to do through my research, but not only research, also teaching and my other activities. For example, I'm director of the Center for Sustainability, Transformation and Responsibility here at WU Vienna. And part of our mission is outreach. So we are currently involved, for example, in the relief efforts for Ukrainian refugees. Another part of the mission is to promote research on grand societal challenges. So what I would say is that I hope that, you know, through my activities, however insignificant, small the contribution may be, to make a tiny contribution to making the world a better place and ensuring that your children, my children, you know, and other people's children have a sustainable future on this planet. Now, of course, you know, this invites the cynic in some people, or they might think, you know, this is really a lofty goal. We are international management scholars, not trying to decipher the genome. So how can we, through our work, you know, how can we make a difference? But I firmly believe, you know, it's possible that we can do that. And this is actually why my research interests have shifted in recent years from more traditional IB research really to all of my work is at the intersection of sustainability, corporate responsibility, and international business. For example, the question of how multinational enterprises through their activities can help tackle the pressing global challenges that we face, right? Because obviously multinational companies have a lot of potential to do harm, right? When we think about, for instance, human rights violations in global supply chains, but they also have a huge potential to do good, right? They can be a force for good because they have, of course, the power and resources. Some multinationals are more wealthy than many nation states, and they also have the capabilities really to help us tackle these pressing societal challenges. And when you think about it, Ilgaz, you know, many of these challenges, like, you know, combating climate change, you know, fighting poverty, reducing inequality, you know, dealing with the influx of migrants in many countries, they have a very strong international and often also cross-cultural component. And I think as international management or international business scholars, we are really uniquely positioned to, sort of develop better knowledge, scientifically valid knowledge on how multinational corporations can tackle these challenges.
Okay, you mentioned we're facing global challenges. I mean, we did go through a couple of cycles over the past 5 years. What's the next 5 to 10 years of the IB fields research going to be focused on? What's the, if you could look into your ball and make a prediction about the next decade for research topics, for junior faculty, for PhD students, what would those be?
Next 5 years. I mean, it's a bit related to what I just said. I think what we will see is a clear trend, to pursue research that addresses questions that are of greater relevance to society, for sure. And we can already see that. I don't know if you attended last year's Academy of Management conference. There was really a mind-boggling number of symposia and PDWs and paper presentations on grand societal challenges and how to address them. I think this year's Academy of Management conference theme is how to create a better world together. There have been so many journal special issues recently encouraging scholars to engage in more relevant and impactful work. For instance, the JIBS 50th anniversary special issue on how international business research can make a difference. So I think that's a very, very clear trend, that, we as international business scholars, engage in work that makes a real difference, has a real impact beyond the narrow confines of academic research. And, this is also, I think it's very encouraging, all these special issues, for example, because it shows that it is possible to, produce work that is relevant and impactful and publish in the top academic journals of our field. And I think that's a fairly new trend that started maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, and we will see much more of it in the future, I'm sure.
Okay. About omitted variables in IB research, things that we have not talked about. I mean, you did mention global challenges, grand societal challenges. You did mention sustainability. I'm going to give you those. But more specifically, what should we think about more, study more? And for the record, in IB, most recent work is about soul searching. What is the field? The soul searching of our potential, where we are, where should we going? But more concrete things for young scholars to work on, things that are omitted.
Yeah, I think many of these discussions, soul-searching discussions, are around how to make our work more impactful, but we already talked about that. But since you raised the issue of omitted variables, I'm not sure, I wouldn't call them omitted variables, but I think the role of context, in international business research, I think is still underexplored or underappreciated. It has improved, over the past 20 years. There's certainly more attention to context, but a recent review of, work on the role of context in management, and I'm one of the authors. We are currently working on this paper for the new Academy of Management journal, Academy of Management collections. And what we found is that in many management subfields, including international management, most studies are still under-contextualized, or context is treated only as a control variable. Even international management, you would think that as a field is highly contextualized by its very nature, right? Because it looks at different geographies, right, and thus different contexts. But even in IB research or international management research, most studies look at one type of context, that's national. differences and ignore all other types of context. For instance, the historical context or the supranational context. Again, thinking about impact, global governance mechanisms like the UN Sustainable Development Goals and their role. And I think context is so important, especially in international business, because when you look at existing meta-analysis, for example, all of them conclude that findings are very inconsistent, often contradictory and paradoxical. And very often when you start considering contextual variables, the puzzle can be resolved and you can actually explain these inconsistent findings. And you even find that dramatic sign reversals occur, right? For example, our meta-analysis, Martha Masnevsky and my meta-analysis that won the JIBS Decade Award, we found that, under some conditions, diversity has a strong negative impact on team creativity, and under other circumstances, it can have a very strong positive effect. It all depends on the context and on how differences are managed. So I think there should be more of it. And especially now junior scholars, they should think very carefully about, what are the moderating influences they need to look at, context variables, also intervening processes. Then we're talking about the mediators, and very often also the role of management-related factors that affect outcomes.
It was very important, and it was very insightful about how context is always a control in many aspects of it. So there must be the composition of the controls, and which is going to be the actual growth in the field. About advice and mentoring, what's the most valuable lesson you learned going through this process up to this point in your life?
Well, one lesson that I learned the hard way, we already talked about that, is the importance, I think, of having a more balanced life and getting your priorities right. We talked about that in my personal experiences. But I think another important lesson, for more junior colleagues is, well, to be, and I mean, that's consistent with common wisdom, to be proactive, take charge, of your career development and professional development, and also, to get all the support that you can from more senior colleagues. And my experience is that, junior faculty, they are often very reluctant to approach senior colleagues because they think they are so busy and preoccupied with other things and seek their help. And this is what I did when I joined INSEAD. I was extremely reluctant to approach colleagues and ask for help. And as you know, at INSEAD, there are, for instance, many brilliant teachers, and I had so much to learn. But I realized very quickly that those who were less reluctant, they benefited hugely from the mentoring and the support that they got from senior colleagues. And in my case, I was very fortunate, two INSEAD colleagues, or one of them was on sabbatical leave there, Paul Evans and Ingmar Björkman. They allowed me to sit in on their classes, use their teaching material. They were extremely generous, and that helped a lot. So my advice would be, be proactive. Don't wait for others to knock on your door and offer their help. Be proactive and seek out mentors, people who are strong on the research side. People who are master teachers, ask them for advice, ask if you can use the teaching materials, right? And of course, also people, who are very familiar with the organization, understand the internal politics, dynamics. All of this is very important, I think, in academia. So be proactive.
Günter, for junior faculty and PhD students, yes, these are great advice points. These are important points. About mid-career people after tenure, what do you see as the biggest challenges for them? And what's the advice for mid-career colleagues?
I mean, mid-career, when I think back on my own career, for me, it was a pressing issue. How can I reinvent myself? When I started off as a junior faculty at INSEAD, it was about, obviously, tenure was, the question, getting my promotion, what needs to be done. But once I had then the promotion to associate, it was really more about something changed, what are the topics that really excite me? And, that also for the next 10 years of my career that I want to engage in, and how can I reinvent myself, and also, of course, issues related to work-life balance, mid-career, all of a sudden I was a father, and so my whole personal situation changed. And around that time was when I decided to have a career change, also, change the institution, go to a place that is a tiny bit maybe less challenging, or where I would have a bit more time for family, for myself. So those kinds of questions, and especially there, it's very, very useful, I think, to have a mentor, someone experienced who can give you advice.
For the sake of time, what's the question that I should have asked you but haven't?
Well, the interview guide that you sent me some time ago was pretty comprehensive. So I didn't identify a gap, but maybe the one thing that you might add, most of the questions centered around research and scholars as mentors, also their personal, life. But what you might want to add is, a certain focus also on teaching international business scholars as educators, because this is what most of us are getting paid for. Basically delivering great teaching, and many of us are passionate about it. But that would probably be too much to cover in a single interview. Maybe for a new Frontiers interview series focusing on educational issues.
I wanted to follow up on that one, actually. I mean, you have a lot of teaching experience in different parts of the world, right? You're basically doing international management teaching in Asian, Pacific area, and then Europe, and you've been to Turkey a couple of times. What's different? I mean, yes, everything is different, but what is different, really? How do you modify your teaching to fit the needs and the students over different parts?
You have to be attentive to cultural differences, for obvious reasons. But I think the importance of culture and cultural difference in the classroom is also sometimes a bit exaggerated, because many of my students, for instance, they have been educated. So I just did a program, an executive MBA program in Oman, for example, right? And all of my students, executives, were fluent in English. They spoke better English than I do, for sure, all of them. Many of them had been educated in the West. Now, that doesn't mean that cultural differences don't matter, but, it's, most of the, topics that interested them, and even, teaching approaches work with them, early on in my career, for instance, I tried to adapt my teaching approach as much as possible, customize it to my audiences. So when I was in Japan, for instance, I avoided using role plays, because I thought, Japanese probably don't respond too well to that. Now I don't do this anymore, right? I don't do too much customization, and it works. And I found that, audiences all over the world enjoy, if teachers have a more interactive approach, try to draw them in, yeah, basically treat them with respect, and then also try to learn from them and their culture. So my recommendation would be, you know, if you are asked to teach in a different cultural context, inform yourself, but don't really adjust too much to your audience. It's not necessary. And, you know, my friend Martha Masnevsky, she said something really interesting. She said, cultural intelligence is not, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, but when in Rome, act in a way that do not offend the Romans, right? So when you teach in a Middle Eastern context, make sure that, you know, obviously religion is a deeply ingrained part of society, and you have to be informed and respect that, prayer times, etc., and be sensitive if it's during Ramadan, certain. But that's about it. Otherwise, you know, basically you can treat them, you know, like Western audiences. This is no problem at all in my experience.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight. I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ilgaz. I enjoyed the conversation. Bye-bye.